The stage lights at the Kennedy Center had a way of turning people into their most flawless versions, brighter, taller, almost untouchable. Tonight, that light belonged to Ethan Hale. The camera swept slowly across the ballroom, gliding over perfectly tailored tuxedos and gowns that moved like silk in motion, before settling on him, the man standing at the podium with that steady, reassuring voice that had silenced rooms full of doubt. "Integrity," he said, one hand resting lightly against the walnut edge of the lectern, "is not what we claim in public. It's what we protect when no one is watching." The room erupted in applause. Champagne glasses chimed like a soft symphony of approval. A few people rose to their feet. Admiring eyes followed him from every angle. The cameras found his best profile, the same face that had appeared on the cover of Financial World last fall beneath the headline, "The Man Investors Trust." In the back of the room, Nia Carter remained standing. She wasn't seated with the distinguished guests, even though her name easily could have been. Instead, she chose the aisle to the left, where the light didn't fully reach, where you could observe without being observed. From there, she saw everything. The slight tilt of Ethan's head when he spoke about major capital, as if numbers of that size were simply details in a much larger vision. The perfectly timed pauses that invited applause. The way his hand touched his chest when he said the word trust. She had once believed those gestures were real. Now she logged them like a report, precise, clinical, emotionless. In her hand was a small, black clutch. Inside, not lipstick or a phone like the other women tonight. A thin envelope, its edges pressed flat, sharp as a line drawn with intent. And on her wrist, catching the dim light, the diamond bracelet still shimmered. A gift. A lie. Ethan closed his speech with a line that would undoubtedly be quoted in every article tomorrow morning. Because in the end, reputation is the only currency that never devalues. The audience rose to their feet. The camera loved him. The crowd loved him. The story he had built about himself, the principled man, the disciplined leader, had reached its most beautiful crescendo. And that was the moment Nia stepped out of the shadows. Not fast, not dramatic, just a single step on polished marble, but enough for a few heads to turn. Her black silk dress didn't sparkle like the others. It traced her body with the quiet certainty of a woman who didn't need decoration to be seen. Her curls were gathered low at the nape of her neck, revealing the elegant line of her shoulders, and the bracelet that had once made her smile on a birthday 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks, long enough for a heart to break. Long enough for a plan to become perfect. Ethan had just stepped down from the stage when he saw her. For a fraction of a second, his flawless smile faltered, so briefly that no one else would notice. No one except Nia. "Baby," he said, his voice still warm with public charm. "I didn't know you were coming." She smiled, soft, loving, convincing enough that anyone watching would see nothing but devotion. Only Ethan, and the secrets inside that envelope, knew what it really meant. "Of course I came," Nia said gently. "I wouldn't miss the night everyone talks about your integrity." Somewhere behind them, a camera shifted, drawn to the image of the perfect couple. The story was still intact. And if you're standing here with Nia, at the edge between truth and illusion, then you understand why some moments don't allow you to turn back. Stay with this story until the end. Tap like if you believe the truth always finds its way into the light. Leave a comment, not for us, but for every woman who has ever stood in the shadows, waiting for her moment to step forward. Because tonight, under the lights that love Ethan Hale, the truth is learning how to be seen. 3 weeks earlier, the night had been soft with candlelight, and the kind of quiet that only exists in Georgetown after the last black car pulls away from the curb. Nia had always loved that street, the narrow row houses with their iron railings, the windows glowing gold behind sheer curtains, the feeling that history lived in the bricks. It made everything feel anchored, certain, as if the life she had built with Ethan was part of something permanent. Her birthday dinners had never been extravagant. She preferred intimacy to spectacle. A table for 3, a good bottle of wine, the low hum of conversation that didn't need to impress anyone. That night, the restaurant had given them a corner banquette draped in shadow and amber light, the kind of place where senators came without their aides and deals were sealed without signatures. Lena arrived last, breathless and radiant, wrapped in a winter white coat that fell from her shoulders like a curtain revealing a stage. Sorry, crisis in DuPont, she said, sliding into the seat beside Nia and pressing a kiss against her cheek. But nothing was going to make me miss your night. Lena always entered a room as if it had been waiting for her. Her laugh was louder than it needed to be. Her perfume, something sharp and expensive, lingered in the air long after she moved. She lived in headlines and guest lists and private text threads with people whose names opened doors. But with Nia, she softened. Or at least she had always seemed to. Ethan lifted his glass. To the woman who makes the rest of us look unprepared. Nia smiled, the familiar warmth of his admiration settling around her like a coat she had worn for years. He knew exactly how to speak about her work, her precision, her discipline, the way she could walk into a room full of executives and make them forget she was the youngest person there. He had always made her feel seen. Dinner unfolded in the easy rhythm of shared history. Lena retold the story of their first apartment in D.C., where the heat broke every winter and they slept in sweaters under the same blanket. Ethan teased Nia about the color-coded spreadsheets she used for vacation planning. Nia watched them both, her two constants, the two people who had witnessed every version of her. At one point, Ethan reached for her hand under the table and pressed his thumb lightly against her pulse. It was such a small gesture, and she had loved him for it. The dessert arrived with a single candle, its flame trembling in the dimness. The restaurant staff sang softly, not the loud performance reserved for tourists, but something almost private, almost reverent. "Make a wish," Lena said. Nia closed her eyes. She didn't wish for success. She already had that. She didn't wish for stability. She had built it herself. She wished for time. Time for the life she was living to stay exactly as it was. When she opened her eyes, Lena was watching her with an expression Nia would later replay over and over. Tender, almost emotional. "I have something for you," Lena said, her voice lower now. "But not here." They stepped outside into the cold, their breath turning to silver in the air. A driver waited at the curb for Ethan, but Lena guided Nia a few steps down the sidewalk, away from the lights spilling out of the restaurant. From her bag, she pulled a small box. Not large, not ostentatious, but heavy in a way that made Nia's fingers instinctively tighten. "You don't have to," Nia began. "I wanted to," Lena interrupted, "because you never let anyone do anything for you. You're always a strong one, the careful one, the one who fixes everything." Her eyes shone in the streetlight. "Just this once, let someone give you something." The lid lifted with a quiet, perfect click. Inside, the diamonds caught the light like captured stars. For a moment, Nia couldn't breathe. "Lena, I know," she said quickly, fastening the bracelet around Nia's wrist before she could protest. "It's too much, that's the point. You deserve too much." The metal was cool against her skin, perfectly fitted, as if it had been measured. From the curb, Ethan watched them, smiling, a silhouette framed by the open car door. "Let me see," he said when they returned. Nia held out her wrist, still stunned. Ethan's eyebrows lifted. "Wow, Lena, you just raised the bar for every future birthday." "I learn from the best," Lena replied lightly, clinking her glass against his. Later, in the car, Ethan brushed his lips against Nia's temple. "You're happy?" he asked. She turned her wrist, watching the bracelet scatter light across the dark leather seat. "Yes," she said, and she had meant it. That night, she placed it carefully on her bedside table before sleeping, the way she did with things she valued. In the morning, she fastened it again before work, the weight of it unfamiliar but not unwelcome. It became part of her. At meetings, it flashed when she turned a page. In elevators, it caught the reflection of fluorescent light. Colleagues noticed. Strangers noticed. "Birthday gift?" someone asked. She smiled. "From my best friend." Each time she said it, it felt like speaking a truth about who she was. A woman surrounded by loyalty, by love that understood her. 3 days later, when she found the charge on Ethan's statement, that memory came back first. Not the number, not the boutique name, but Lena's voice, soft in the cold air. You deserve too much. Nia sat on the edge of the bed with the statement in her hand and the bracelet on her wrist. And for the first time since that night, it felt wrong. Not heavy, not tight, just misplaced. As if it had been meant for another life, another woman, or another story entirely. The morning she saw the charge, Washington was washed in that pale winter light that made everything look honest. Nia had always liked mornings for their clarity. Coffee tasted sharper, decisions felt cleaner, numbers, especially numbers, told the truth without needing interpretation. It was one of the reasons she had built her life around risk, compliance, and the quiet architecture of accountability. In her world, a misplaced decimal could unravel a merger. A missing signature could collapse a deal. Nothing escaped the record. She was standing at the kitchen counter in the townhouse she shared with Ethan, barefoot on the cool marble, scrolling through her phone while the espresso machine hummed softly behind her. The city outside the tall windows was just beginning to move. Early commuters in dark coats, a dog walker pulling reluctant leashes, the faint wail of a siren somewhere near M Street. It was an ordinary motion that brought the line into her life. A notification, a credit card statement, a habit of verification she had never been able to turn off. She wasn't looking for anything. That was the part she would return to later. The innocence of the moment, the fact that she had been thinking about a meeting at 10, about a report she needed to finalize, about whether they were out of oat milk. Her thumb moved down the list of transactions the way it always did, automatically categorizing, automatically understanding. Dinner in Chicago, client meeting, car service, airport transfer, hotel, London, 3 nights. Normal, expected, documented. And then Cartier, Washington, D.C., $10,284.17. Her finger stopped moving. It didn't feel like shock at first. Shock was too loud a word. This was something quieter, a small shift in the air, like when a room changes temperature by a single degree and your body notices before your mind does. She read the line again. Cartier, Washington, D.C., $10,284.17. 3 days before her birthday. The espresso machine clicked off behind her, the sudden silence loud enough to make her glance over her shoulder. Ethan had already left for the gym. His coffee cup sat in the sink, a half-inch of dark liquid cooling at the bottom. The chair he always used was pushed back at an angle that still held the shape of his morning. Everything in the room was exactly where it should be, except for that number. $10,284.17. Nia didn't think about the bracelet immediately. Her mind, trained by years of forensic precision, moved through possibilities the way a searchlight moves across water. A client gift, a donor event, a purchase for his mother. There were always explanations. In her world, there had to be. But the date stayed where it was, unblinking. 3 days before her birthday. Her hand lowered slowly to the counter, the phone still in her grip. The marble beneath her palm was cold, grounding. She focused on her breathing, on the rhythm she used in high-stakes meetings when everyone else in the room was unraveling. Inhale, hold, exhale. She lifted her wrist without thinking. The bracelet answered the light. It had become part of her so quickly, a glimmer at the edge of every gesture, a quiet affirmation that she was loved, that she was known. Lena's voice came back to her with unnerving clarity. You deserve too much. The number on the screen seemed to lean toward it. Cartier, Washington, D.C., $10,284.17. The exact range, the exact timing, the exact impossibility. Her reflection in the darkened window looked back at her, composed, still in her silk robe, the bracelet bright against her skin. She studied that reflection the way she studied risk profiles, searching for anomalies, for the place where the narrative stopped aligning with the data. A memory rose uninvited. Lena fastening the clasp with practiced fingers. Ethan watching from the curb, smiling in that soft, admiring way. the cold air turning their breath into mist. Measured. The word came to her with a precision that made her stomach tighten. The bracelet had fit too perfectly. Not adjusted, not guessed. Measured. She set the phone down carefully on the counter, as if any sudden movement might disturb the fragile balance of the morning. The kitchen clock ticked above the doorway, each second louder than it had been before. This was the moment her life divided itself into two clean columns. Before the line, after the line. Before there had been warmth, the easy certainty of shared routines, the casual intimacy of his hand at the small of her back, the way Lena's name lit up her screen with a familiarity that felt like home. After, there was only the question. Not what happened, but what does this mean? Because in Nia's world, numbers were never just numbers. They were intent. They were evidence. They were the quiet signature beneath every lie. She picked up the phone again, forcing herself to look at the screen one more time, to confirm what she already knew her mind would never allow her to unknow. Cartier, Washington, D.C. $10,284.17. Her thumb hovered over the transaction details. For a long moment, she didn't move. Some doors, once opened, erased the architecture of everything that came before them. In the reflection of the window, the bracelet flashed. Beautiful, precise, and suddenly unfamiliar, as if it had never belonged to her at all. Nia closed her eyes, not to escape, to prepare, because whatever lived behind that line item was not a misunderstanding. It was a record, and records, once read, could never be unread. After the line on the statement, nothing in Nia's life changed, and that was the first thing that changed. The townhouse in Georgetown still woke in the same measured way, sunlight touching the staircase one narrow step at a time, the faint mechanical sigh of the thermostat adjusting to morning, the scent of Ethan's cologne lingering in the hallway long after he had left for work. The rhythm of their days continued with the same precision it always had. Only now, she watched it, not as a woman in love, but as a woman trained to recognize discrepancies. The first almost came that same night. Ethan was in the kitchen, sleeves rolled to his forearms, pouring wine into the heavy crystal glasses they had bought together in Prague. He spoke about a meeting, a new infrastructure fund, a potential West Coast partnership, the language of his world flowing easily, convincingly. Late call tonight, he added, almost as an afterthought. Singapore. Time zones are brutal. It was the kind of detail she had never questioned before. His life operated across continents. Late calls were the tax they paid for ambition. At 10:30, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen, not at her, and stepped out onto the small balcony that overlooked the narrow street below. The glass door slid shut behind him with a soft click. Nia remained at the dining table, a document open in front of her that she wasn't reading. The city reflected faintly in the dark window, passing headlights, the ghost of her own face layered over the room. His voice outside was low, not urgent, not professional, low in the way people speak when they are protecting something. She didn't move. She didn't listen. She simply looked at the time, 10:32 p.m. Singapore would be mid-morning, a normal hour. There would be no need to lower his voice. When he came back in, he smiled, apologetic, familiar, and touched the back of her chair as he passed. Sorry, that dragged longer than I thought. Almost. It was an explanation that fit, a detail that could be true. But the tone of his voice outside didn't match the ease of his return. The second almost belonged to Lena. 3 days later, they met for coffee at their usual place near DuPont Circle. Lena arrived late again, breathless again, radiant again, her life always just slightly ahead of everyone else's. You look tired, Lena said, reaching across the table and brushing a curl away from Nia's face with a tenderness that had once felt like sisterhood. Quarter end, Nia replied. You know how it is. They spoke about work, about a senator Lena had just placed on a panel, about a client who wanted to rebrand himself as ethical. It was the language of their shared city, influence dressed as virtue. Halfway through the conversation, Lena's phone lit up. She didn't pick it up. She glanced at it. Just a flick of her eyes, fast, practiced. Then she turned the screen face down. Not unusual, not suspicious, except that a second later, her smile came. Too quick, too bright, as if it had been summoned to replace something else. "Are you still coming to the summit next month?" Lena asked. "Ethan's keynote is going to be everywhere." "Of course," Nia said. Lena nodded, but her attention had already slipped. A fraction, back to the phone. The conversation continued, fluid, familiar, almost identical to 100 others they had shared. But in between Lena's sentences were small absences, moments where she seemed to be elsewhere, answering a message that hadn't been read, reacting to a thought that hadn't been spoken aloud. When they hugged goodbye, Lena held on a second longer than usual. "I miss you," she said into Nia's hair. Almost, because the words were right. The timing was right. But the pressure of her arms felt like compensation, as if she were giving more to make up for something unseen. The third almost arrived without warning. A Friday night, rain against the windows, the easy comfort of takeout cartons spread across the coffee table. Ethan was scrolling through his phone, half listening to a documentary they had both already seen. "Lena texted," he said casually. "She's trying to lock down donors for that media fund. She might call you about compliance." Nia looked up. "Tonight?" "Not sure. She just asked if you were around this weekend." He didn't look at her when he said it. His tone was neutral, informational, perfectly normal. But a minute later, his phone vibrated again. This time he turned it slightly away from her before answering, his body angling in a way that blocked her line of sight. A gesture so small it would have been invisible to anyone who wasn't trained to see patterns. He typed quickly, paused, typed again, then set the phone face down on the table. Almost, because it could still be Lena. It could still be about donors. It could still be nothing. Later that night, when he fell asleep beside her, his breathing slow and even, Nia lay awake staring at the ceiling, the bracelet cool against her skin. 3 moments, 3 explanations that worked on the surface, 3 narratives that aligned just enough to be accepted. In her professional life, this was the point where she would open a new file, not because she had proof, but because the data did not reconcile. The call that didn't need privacy, the friend whose attention lived somewhere else, the message that required a turned shoulder. None of them were lies. Not yet. They were something more dangerous. They were almost, and almost, Nia knew better than anyone, was the space where truth learned how to hide. Nia did not confront him. The realization came to her with the same calm certainty she used when closing a high-risk review. Not emotional, not impulsive, but final. Questions, she knew, were a form of mercy. Questions gave people time to prepare their answers, time to rearrange facts, time to turn instinct into doubt. And Nia Carter had not built her career or her life on doubt. So she said nothing. The townhouse continued to function as if it were still a place built on shared trust. She woke at the same hour. She brewed coffee for 2. She asked about his meetings and listened with the same attentive tilt of her head she had always used. The gesture so authentic, even she almost believed it. If there was a performance happening, she was now its most disciplined actor. But inside her mind, a system had come online. She began with time, not memories. Those were unreliable, softened by love and routine, but time as it existed in records. Calendar entries, travel confirmations, panel schedules, the archived precision of digital life. Her own calendar came first. She sat at her desk in the compliance office. The city spread beneath her in winter gray and opened the past 3 months. Every day was a structure of meetings, briefings, deadlines. Every evening a notation. Dinner with Ethan, drinks with Lena, the charity event at the Mayflower, the weekend in Baltimore. She overlaid his travel schedule. London, Chicago, San Francisco. At first, everything aligned. It had to. Ethan lived by logistics. His world ran on coordination and visibility. But Nia wasn't looking for what matched. She was looking for the negative space. The nights he returned earlier than planned. The weekends that had been tentative. The hours that existed without documentation. In compliance, they called it a reconciliation gap. The place where a narrative stopped corresponding with the ledger. There were more of them than she had expected. She did not react. She opened a second document. A timeline, date, location, declared purpose, observed behavior. It was methodical, almost tender in its care. The same precision she once used to plan their vacations now mapped the subtle dissonance of his movements. Tuesday, late call, balcony. Friday, Lena text, phone turned away. Sunday, gym, 90 minutes longer than usual. Each entry was small, insignificant alone. Together, they began to form a pattern. At night, lying beside him, she replayed conversations not for their emotional weight, but for their structure. The way he had said certain words, the way Lena had shifted topics too quickly, the way both of them used the same phrasing when explaining an absence. A verbal fingerprint she had never noticed before. It was not pain that guided her. It was curiosity, the disciplined, relentless curiosity that had made her indispensable in rooms full of men who underestimated her because she was young, because she was a black woman, because she was quiet. She had learned long ago that the most powerful position in any room was the one who spoke last, the one who already knew the answer. One evening, Ethan stood behind her in the kitchen, wrapping his arms around her waist while she chopped herbs for dinner. "You've been working too hard," he murmured against her shoulder. "Take a day off this weekend. We'll disappear somewhere." Disappear. The word settled into her mind like a piece of evidence. She turned in his arms and smiled up at him, the same open smile she had given him for years. "I'd like that," she said, and she meant it. Because she wanted to see how he would plan it, because she wanted to see what he would need to rearrange. The next morning, his calendar changed. A lunch moved, a call rescheduled, a block of time created where there had been none before. She watched the notification appear on the shared screen in his office, the casual transparency they had always practiced, and felt a strange, distant admiration. He was good. So was she. At work, her colleagues noticed nothing except her increased efficiency. Reports arrived earlier. Risk assessments were sharper. Her questions in meetings cut directly to the point where others began to shift in their chairs. "You're on fire lately," Marcus from legal told her. She smiled. What she did not say was that the skills they applauded had not been sharpened for the firm. They had been sharpened for survival. The bracelet remained on her wrist, not as sentiment, as calibration. Its weight reminded her of the number, $10,284.17, a fixed point in a field of variables. She did not remove it. Auditors never discarded the initial trigger. They kept it visible, a reference that ensured the investigation never drifted into abstraction. Weeks earlier, she would have reached for Lena, called her late at night, spoken the uncertainty aloud, asked for reassurance. Now she reviewed their message history the way she reviewed vendor communications, not for what was said, but for frequency, for timing, for the subtle shift in tone that signaled alignment or concealment. There were fewer late-night texts, more midday check-ins, an increase in exclamation points, compensation, overstatement of normalcy. Mia closed the file and leaned back in her chair. She did not cry. Grief required a conclusion, and she was not there yet. What she felt instead was the quiet expansion of clarity, the same sensation she experienced when a complex investigation finally began to resolve, when the scattered details arranged themselves into a coherent structure. She didn't need a confession. Confessions were narratives. She needed a record, because records did not care about love. They did not soften for history. They did not hesitate. They simply existed, waiting for someone disciplined enough to read them. And Nia Carter, who had spent her life ensuring that powerful men could not hide behind ambiguity, was now applying that same discipline to the only case that had ever had the power to break her. She didn't ask. She audited. And in the silence between their shared routines, in the ordinary gestures, in the familiar spaces, the truth was already beginning to assemble itself, line by careful line. The proof did not arrive with drama. It came on a Tuesday afternoon, wrapped in the quiet ordinariness of a day that had begun like any other. Structured meetings, red-line contracts, the soft percussion of keyboards in the compliance office. Naya had learned long ago that truth rarely announced itself. It appeared in the margins. In the small, overlooked details, people assumed no one would ever examine closely enough. That afternoon, she wasn't looking for it. She had opened Ethan's shared calendar only to confirm a date for the summit, a logistical necessity, something they had always navigated together without secrecy. Their lives had been built on transparency, on overlapping schedules and mutual access. It had once been a symbol of trust. Now it was simply a source. The entry she clicked on was a past travel confirmation, a routine cross-check. Chicago, 2 nights, client meetings, everything aligned. Flight departure, hotel reservation, car service, clean. But Ethan had always been efficient, too efficient. Every transaction documented, every expense categorized. It was one of the reasons investors trusted him. His life left a paper trail. Mia opened the file with the same neutral attention she would have given any vendor audit. Itemized charges, room service, conference dining. Then, at the bottom, a line that didn't belong. Courier service. Her pulse didn't change. She had trained it not to. The amount was small compared to the rest. Almost forgettable. The kind of fee most people would scroll past without a second glance. But the destination field was fully listed. Not the office, not the townhouse. An address, Washington, D.C., Navy Yard. Her eyes moved over it once, then again. In her professional life, this was the moment where intuition stepped aside and verification began. She copied the address into a new document. She did not search it immediately. First, she cross-referenced the date. The courier had been dispatched the same afternoon as the Cartier charge, 3 days before her birthday. The room around her remained unchanged. Colleagues discussing regulatory language in low voices. The city muted beyond the glass. But the air inside her shifted, as if a door had opened somewhere she could not yet see. Only then did she enter the address into the search bar. The image loaded slowly, each pixel resolving into a building she did not recognize. Glass and steel, private balconies, a lobby designed for people who preferred anonymity disguised as luxury. Not a hotel, a residence. The listing appeared beneath the map, a high-rise known for short-term corporate leases and discreet long-term tenants. The kind of place where no one asked questions as long as the payments cleared. Nia stared at the screen, her face reflected faintly over the image of the building. She did not feel the collapse she had once imagined betrayal would bring. No sudden fracture, no cinematic break. What she felt was alignment, a point where scattered data converged into a single, undeniable line. The bracelet on her wrist caught the light as she moved her hand to the mouse. Measured, the thought returned, clearer now, perfectly fitted. Not guessed, not approximate, measured. Her mind began its reconstruction with quiet precision. The Chicago trip, the courier dispatched from Washington, the Cartier purchase, the gift that had never passed through Lena's hands as a buyer, only as a messenger. A transfer, not affection. Logistics. She closed the map and opened her timeline document. New entry, courier, D.C. to Navy Yard address. Date, 3 days before birthday, linked to Cartier transaction. Her fingers paused over the keyboard for the first time since she had begun the audit. In compliance work, the discovery of an undisclosed location carried a specific weight. It signaled not just concealment, but intent, the creation of a parallel space outside the declared structure. A second life required an address. She leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes, not to escape the image of the building, to see it more clearly. The lobby with its neutral art. The elevator that required a key fob. The hallway where doors closed softly behind people who valued privacy. She imagined Ethan walking through it, not as the man who left their home each morning with a kiss to her temple, but as the version of him that existed in those reconciliation gaps she had been mapping for weeks. The version she had never been invited to know. When she opened her eyes, the office felt sharper, every sound more defined. She did not cry. Grief still required confirmation. And she was not finished. The address was not an answer. It was a coordinate. In any investigation, a coordinate changed everything. It transformed suspicion into geography, doubt into a place you could stand in front of, a door that could be opened, a name that could be verified. She printed the page without looking at it again. The papers slid into the tray with a soft, almost polite sound. On her wrist, the bracelet gleamed, its diamonds precise, its clasp flawless, its origin now traced through a courier route to a building she had never entered. A gift that had traveled a path she had not been meant to see. Nia folded the paper once and placed it inside her notebook. Not hidden, filled. Because this was no longer a question of whether something had happened. This was structure. There was a location. And in every system she had ever dismantled, the moment you found the undisclosed address was the moment the illusion of compliance ended. Everything after that was simply documentation. She rose from her desk, smoothing the front of her jacket, her expression unchanged. To anyone watching, she was still the same, the composed director of risk, moving through the afternoon with the quiet authority that had always defined her. But somewhere in the architecture of her life, a door had appeared, and now she knew exactly where it led. The second inbox did not belong to her. That was the first thing Nia understood. It existed in a space she had never needed to enter before. Not because it was hidden with extraordinary skill, but because their life together had never required the instinct to look for it. Trust, she had once believed, was not the absence of secrecy. It was the absence of the need to search. The afternoon she found it, the townhouse was quiet in that suspended way that belonged only to the hours between 3 and 5. When the city was still working and the street outside their windows moved in muted patterns of routine. Ethan had texted that he would be late. Client dinner. The message had arrived with its usual warmth, a heart at the end, a promise to bring back dessert from the place she loved. Nia stood in the doorway of his study for a long moment before stepping inside. She had entered this room 1,000 times before, to borrow a pen, to leave a document, to sit on the edge of his desk while he spoke through a headset to people in different time zones. It had always smelled faintly of leather in the cedar lining of his closet. Nothing in it had ever felt closed to her. His laptop was open. Not in invitation, in carelessness. The screen had dimmed, but not locked. A half-written email paused mid-sentence. She did not move toward it immediately. Instead, she crossed to the bookshelf, letting her fingers drift across the spines of the biographies he loved, the framed photograph of them in Lisbon, the small glass paperweight he used to hold down contracts. Normal. Everything in the room still belonged to the version of their life that had existed before the line on the statement. When she finally sat in his chair, she did so with the same posture she used in boardrooms. Back straight, hands resting lightly, breath controlled. She told herself she was verifying a detail. The Chicago trip, the courier, the address. The email account that appeared first was the one she knew. The professional one, immaculate, structured, every thread labeled, every exchange archived. It held nothing she hadn't already seen, which was precisely why the anomaly stood out. A second tab, not minimized, not concealed, just separate. Gmail. The address was unfamiliar. Not his name, not his firm. A sequence of letters and numbers that meant nothing at first glance. A private account. Her hand did not tremble when she clicked. Auditors did not react to the existence of an undisclosed account. They recorded it. The inbox opened to a screen that had none of the disciplined order of his professional correspondence. No folders, no flags, no carefully categorized threads. Only a series of conversations, personal, unstructured, alive. The most recent message sat at the top. Did you tell her about the summit date? Her eyes moved to the sender's name, Lena. There was no collapse. Not yet. Just a stillness so complete it felt like the air had been removed from the room. She did not open the thread immediately. Instead, she scanned the timestamps. Midday exchanges on days he had been in meetings. Late-night confirmations on evenings he had stood on the balcony with his voice lowered. Photos, the small image icons that signaled attachments. A pattern, the same pattern she had been mapping in her timeline. Except here it was not inference, it was record. When she clicked the conversation open, the screen filled with a language she recognized and did not. Not because the words were unfamiliar, but because they were intimate in a way that had never belonged to her. Same place tomorrow? She thinks I'm in San Francisco. You looked at me across that table, and I almost forgot to breathe. Her gaze moved across the lines with the discipline of someone reviewing evidence in a regulatory case, noting dates, correlating them with travel logs, observing the evolution of tone. At first, cautious, then assured, then careless. There were hotel confirmations forwarded from one account to another, screenshots of flight changes, a photograph taken in a mirror she did not recognize, of Lena in a dress Nia had once admired, Ethan's hand visible at her waist. Her breath remained even, because the work of understanding required steadiness. The sentence that finally made her stop was not the most explicit. It was the most ordinary. Did she like the bracelet? The reply came seconds later. She cried. A pause. Then, perfect. Nia closed her eyes, not to block the screen, to hold the shape of that word in her mind. Perfect. In her world, perfection meant compliance, a system operating exactly as designed, every control functioning, every risk mitigated. Here, it meant the opposite. It meant the success of a deception calibrated to the smallest detail. She opened her eyes and read on. There were no declarations of love, no promises of forever. What existed between them was something colder and more precise. Coordination, alignment, the satisfaction of two people moving within a structure only they could see. A second life, not accidental, engineered. The realization did not break her. It clarified her. For weeks, she had been assembling fragments, time discrepancies, tonal shifts, the undisclosed address. This was the architecture, the hidden ledger. In compliance investigations, the discovery of a second communication channel marked the end of speculation. It was the moment when intent ceased to be a theory and became a demonstrable fact. She did not scroll to the beginning. The past in its entirety was unnecessary. She had enough. Dates, language, confirmation of the gift's origin. The bracelet on her wrist seemed to grow heavier, not with sentiment, but with context. She logged out. Carefully, she returned the screen to the email he had left open, the half-written message exactly as it had been, the cursor blinking in its patient rhythm. Then she stood. For a moment, she remained in the center of the room, her gaze moving over the objects that had once represented their shared life. The photograph in Lisbon, the paperweight, the chair where he read on Sunday mornings. Nothing had changed. And everything had. The second inbox had not destroyed the first. It had revealed its purpose, a cover. When Ethan came home later that night, he found her on the sofa with a report open on her lap, the soft lamplight turning her skin to gold. He bent to kiss her temple, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder, the same gesture, the same warmth. "You're still working?" She looked up at him and smiled. Calm, luminous, utterly familiar. "Just finishing something up," she said. And for the first time since the investigation had begun, it was not a performance. It was a conclusion, because now she no longer needed to search for truth. She had seen it, organized and time-stamped, living in a space that had never been meant for her eyes. The second inbox had closed the gap between almost and certainty. And certainty, Nia knew better than anyone, changed the nature of everything that came after. The night it shifted, nothing extraordinary happened. There was no storm outside the windows, no raised voices, no dramatic gesture that marked the turning point. The townhouse held its usual quiet, the low glow of the lamps, the distant murmur of traffic drifting up from the street, the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway that had always measured their shared life in patient, unremarkable seconds. Ethan came home later than he had promised. He always texted when that happened. "Running behind. Don't wait up for dinner. I'll bring something back." The message arrived with the same easy affection it always carried, a familiarity that once would have made her smile. Nia had already eaten, not because she was angry, because she no longer organized her hunger around his schedule. It was a small adjustment, almost invisible, but it was the first time in years she had made a decision that did not include him. She was in the bedroom when he walked in, the soft lamplight catching on the silk of her robe, a document open in front of her that she had not been reading for several minutes. "Hey," he said, loosening his tie, his voice warm with the comfort of coming home. "You're still up." "I had a deadline," she replied, looking up with a calm that surprised even her. He crossed the room and bent to kiss her temple. The gesture was perfect. The same angle, the same pressure, the same pause of his hand on her shoulder. For years, it had been the punctuation mark at the end of their days, the physical reassurance that whatever existed outside their door, inside it, they were aligned. Now it felt like choreography, beautiful, precise, empty of meaning. "You should get some sleep," he said. "Big week coming up." He moved toward the closet, the familiar rustle of fabric, the quiet routine of undressing. Everything about him was unchanged. The rhythm of his movements, the way he placed his watch in the same tray every night, the way he checked his phone one last time before setting it face down. She watched him with the clarity of someone seeing a stranger, where the body of a man she had loved. The grief she had expected, the cinematic collapse, the suffocating heartbreak did not come. What came instead was distance, not emotional, structural, like stepping back from a painting and suddenly seeing the frame. For weeks, she had been moving through a labyrinth of evidence, mapping timelines, correlating data, assembling the architecture of a betrayal so carefully constructed it had lived beside her without casting a shadow. But this quiet room, this ordinary night, was where the last illusion dissolved. Because she realized something that had nothing to do with Ethan. She had never been the one deceived. She had been the one they thought would never look. The one they assumed would accept the story presented to her because she loved too completely, trusted too deeply, lived too honestly to imagine duplicity at that scale. They had not hidden the truth well. They had hidden it in plain sight, inside her faith in them. The humiliation she had feared, the image of herself as the woman everyone pitied, shifted into something else entirely. They had not made her small. They had made themselves predictable. Ethan slid into bed beside her, the mattress dipping with his weight, his arm reaching for her in the instinctive movement of habit. She let him. Not because she wanted the comfort, because she wanted the data point. His hand rested at her waist, the warmth of his skin familiar, the pattern of his breathing settling into sleep within minutes. For years, she had fallen asleep to that rhythm. Tonight, she stayed awake, not staring at the ceiling, not replaying messages or images. She was thinking about control. In every investigation she had ever led, there was a moment when the subject believed the narrative still belonged to them, when they moved through their routines unaware that the structure had already collapsed around them. That was the moment power shifted, not when the truth was revealed, when the investigator knew enough to stop reacting and begin designing. She turned her head slightly and looked at him in the dim light. He looked younger when he slept, less certain, less composed. The public version of Ethan Hale, the man who spoke about integrity to rooms full of donors and investors, did not exist here. Here he was simply a body at rest, unaware that the life he had curated with such precision had already been read, cataloged, and understood. Her hand moved to her wrist. The bracelet caught the faint light from the hallway. She remembered the night it had been fastened there. Lena's voice soft with affection, Ethan's smile from the curb, the illusion of being surrounded by loyalty so complete it had felt like safety. Now it was something else, not a symbol of love, a marker. The origin point of the investigation that had returned her to herself. She unfastened it slowly. The clasp released with a sound so quiet it might have been imagined. For a moment she held it in her palm, its weight precise, its beauty unchanged. Then she placed it in the drawer of her nightstand. Not thrown away, not hidden, filled. Because that was what it had become, evidence. When she lay back down, she did not move toward him. She stayed on her side of the bed, her body aligned with the edge of the mattress, the space between them no longer an absence, but a boundary. In the morning, he would wake and kiss her temple again. He would speak about meetings and travel and the summit. He would believe the story was still his to tell, and she would smile. Not because she was pretending, because the woman who had once needed the story to be true was no longer there. Somewhere between the first line on the statement and the second inbox, between the undisclosed address and the mirrored photographs, Nia had crossed an invisible threshold. She was no longer the person waiting for the truth. She was the person holding it. And in that quiet bedroom, with the city breathing beyond the windows, and the man who had betrayed her sleeping within reach, the last trace of humiliation dissolved into something colder, cleaner, infinitely more powerful. This was the moment she stopped being the joke. Not when he was exposed, not when the world knew, but here, in the silence, when she understood that the narrative had shifted. He was still living inside a story built on performance. She was already writing the ending. Revenge, Nia realized, was a language for people who had lost control. It was loud, emotional, messy. It belonged to rooms where voices rose and truths were thrown like glass, shattering in ways that cut everyone, including the person who held them. But Nia Carter had never lived her life in rooms like that. She lived in systems. And systems required something far more powerful than anger. They required design. The morning after she removed the bracelet from her wrist, she arrived at her office earlier than usual. The building was still half asleep, the elevators echoing with the hollow quiet of pre-dawn arrivals. The cleaning crew moving like ghosts through corridors of glass and steel. Her office lights came on with a soft, clinical glow. Everything inside was exactly where she had left it. The files aligned in perfect geometry, the framed certification on the wall, the city beyond the window waiting to be organized into another day of risk assessments and regulatory language. For years, this room had been the place where she protected other people's reputations. Now it became the place where she would dismantle one, not with exposure, with truth. The distinction mattered. Exposure was spectacle. Truth was infrastructure. She opened a new file and titled it with a neutrality that would have meant nothing to anyone else. Reconciliation. Personal. Inside it, she began to move the pieces she had gathered. The timeline. The courier record. The second inbox, not copied in its entirety, but indexed. Dates, subjects, attachments, cross-referenced with travel logs and public appearances. There was no duplication, no stolen data, only what existed in verifiable form. In compliance work, the cleanest case was the one that could survive scrutiny from the very people it implicated. Her training guided her hand. She did not include emotion. Emotion could be questioned. Records could not. At noon, investigations failed when they became personal. She walked to the window and looked down at the city, the slow procession of black cars, the rhythm of pedestrians crossing against the light, the architecture of power that had always defined Washington. This was Ethan's world, a world built on perception, on credibility, on the quiet agreement that trust was currency. And she understood, with a clarity that felt almost tender, that she did not need to destroy him. She only needed to remove the illusion that protected him. First, the record. A version of the truth that existed independently of her voice. Not a risk assessment. A document that asked a single question in the language investors understood. What is the exposure? Conflict of interest. Undisclosed use of time and resources. Vulnerability to coercion. No mention of love. Only governance. Second, the recipient. Not the press. Not social media. Those were arenas of noise, where truth dissolved into opinion. She chose the people whose relationship to Ethan was not emotional. The ones who evaluated him in numbers, in trust metrics, in fiduciary language. The summit guest list sat open in another window. Donors, board members, institutional partners. The architecture of his authority. She did not need all of them, only the right ones, the ones who understood that integrity was not a speech. It was a compliance threshold. Third, the timing. Timing was everything in investigations. Too early, and the subject adapted. Too late, and the damage spread. The summit offered something no private confrontation ever could. Witnesses. Not to humiliation, to credibility. He would stand on stage and speak about trust. And at the precise moment that trust reached its highest valuation, she would introduce the data that recalculated it. Not publicly, never theatrically. Clean, documented, irrefutable. She closed the file and sat back in her chair, her hands resting lightly in her lap. For the first time since the investigation began, she allowed herself to feel something that was not analysis. It was not satisfaction. It was not even relief. It was alignment. The same sensation she had felt at the end of her most complex cases, when every variable had been accounted for, when every outcome had been modeled, when the system that once seemed opaque revealed its internal logic. That night at home, Ethan spoke about the summit over dinner. "They moved my keynote to the closing session," he said, his voice carrying the quiet pride he never quite concealed from her. "Prime slot, full media coverage." "That's incredible," she replied, and it was not a lie. It was incredible because it meant the valuation would be at its highest point when the recalculation occurred. He reached for her hand across the table, his thumb brushing her palm in the familiar way that had once made her feel chosen. "You'll be there, right?" She looked at him, at the man who still believed the narrative belonged to him, who still moved through their shared space with the ease of someone whose life had never been audited. "Of course," she said. Later, when he slept, she returned to the study and opened the file once more. Not to change anything, to review. Every clean plan required a final question. Could it stand without her? If she removed herself entirely, would the structure still hold? The answer was yes, because she had not built a weapon. She had built a record. And records did not need witnesses to exist. They only needed to be placed in the right hands. When she closed the laptop, the house was silent. The city beyond the windows had gone dark in its higher floors. The monuments in the distance lit with their eternal, indifferent glow. For weeks, she had moved through grief like a corridor with no visible end. Now she stood in a different kind of space, not before the confrontation, not after the revelation, but inside the design, the clean plan, where nothing was driven by rage, where every step had already been calculated, where the outcome did not depend on what Ethan would say, or Lena would deny, or the world would believe, only on what the records showed. And in that structure, precise, disciplined, untouched by spectacle, Nia found the first true measure of her freedom. Washington dressed differently for power. The streets around the Kennedy Center were closed to ordinary traffic, black cars lining the curb in a slow procession of tinted windows and silent drivers. Lights spilled across the marble steps in long, deliberate beams, as if the building itself understood the importance of being seen. Inside, the air carried the polished scent of money and diplomacy, champagne, expensive cologne, the faint trace of camera equipment warming under stage lights. Nia arrived alone, not because she had to, because it was the first visible line she drew that belonged only to her. Her name was still on the guest list beside Ethan's. It always had been, but she walked through the entrance without waiting for him, without looking for the familiar lift of his hand in the crowd. The woman who once measured her arrival by his presence no longer existed. The gown she wore was black, but not the soft black of seduction. This was architectural, silk cutting clean lines that followed her body without clinging, the neckline high, the sleeves long, the kind of elegance that did not ask for attention and therefore received it. Her hair was gathered at the nape of her neck. No diamonds, no bracelet, nothing that carried a past. The room turned toward her in small increments, not because she was the most adorned woman in it. There were others in gold, in sequins, in colors designed to command the eye, but because she moved through the space with the quiet certainty of someone who did not need to be announced. Power in Washington recognized its own language. She greeted donors she had met through compliance briefings, nodded to a senator whose campaign she had once helped vet for regulatory exposure, accepted a glass of champagne she did not intend to drink. Every interaction was precise, measured. Her voice held the same warmth it always had, her smile the same composure. Nothing in her behavior suggested that tonight was anything other than another evening in a city built on reputation. Across the room, Ethan stood at the center of a small constellation of people. He was in his element, a dark tuxedo, perfectly cut, the easy posture of a man who understood the value of visibility. His hand rested lightly at the back of a donor's chair. his head inclined in attentive listening, his smile calibrated to just the right degree of humility. The cameras loved him. She watched as one of the event coordinators leaned in to speak to him, her expression deferential. A last-minute change in timing, a confirmation of his closing keynote, the prime position. He had told her about it at dinner, pride carefully moderated, as if success were something that simply happened to him rather than something he orchestrated. He looked up then, as if some instinct had drawn his attention across the room. Their eyes met. For a moment, the years between them returned. The shared mornings, the vacations planned on spreadsheets, the nights when his hand at her back had been a promise instead of a performance. His face softened into that familiar smile, and he began to move toward her. The crowd parted for him without realizing it was doing so. People stepped aside, conversations paused, the subtle choreography of influence creating a clear path. "Nia," he said when he reached her, his voice low, warm, intimate despite the cameras only a few feet away. "You look—" He stopped, not because she wasn't beautiful, because she was different. There was nothing in her expression that required him. No leaning toward him, no unconscious mirroring of his posture. She was entirely self-contained. "You came early," he added, recovering with the ease that had made him so effective in every room he entered. "I had a few people to speak with," she replied. It was true. She had already identified them, not approached them, simply confirmed their presence. The board member whose signature finalized major allocations. The institutional partner known for his intolerance of reputational risk. The legal advisor who had built his career on governance failures. They moved through the same space as everyone else, unaware that their proximity to one another formed a network more significant than any seating chart. Ethan touched her elbow lightly, guiding her toward the center of the room, toward visibility. "Stay close tonight," he said. "Media's everywhere. Stay close." Once the phrase would have felt like belonging. Now it was a logistical note. She allowed him to introduce her to a group of donors, listened as he spoke about her with the same careful admiration he had always used. The smartest woman in any room, the one who keeps all of us honest. The irony was flawless. Lena arrived later. Her entrance was a ripple, a shift in attention, a few heads turning, the low hum of recognition. She wore silver tonight, a dress that caught the light with every movement, her hair falling over one shoulder in deliberate asymmetry. She saw Nia almost immediately. For a fraction of a second, so brief it might have been imagined, something in her expression faltered. Then the smile appeared, radiant, affectionate, perfect. "Nia," she breathed, arms already opening. The embrace was warm, familiar, carefully calibrated to the exact pressure of years of friendship. "You look incredible," Lena said, holding her at arm's length. "Ethan told me you'd be here." Of course he had. In the architecture of their second life, information flowed freely. "I wouldn't miss it," Nia replied. Her voice carried no edge, no distance, only the calm of a woman who no longer required answers. They stood together for a moment, the three of them, the image so complete it might have been photographed for a magazine spread about influence in modern power. The perfect alignment. The closing keynote would begin in 20 minutes. On stage, technicians adjusted microphones. The screens flickered with the event's branding. Words like integrity, trust, impact, repeating in elegant typography. Nia excused herself with the grace that had always defined her, moving toward the corridor that led to the smaller reception rooms. Not to prepare. Everything was already prepared. To take her position. The folder in her hand was slim, indistinguishable from the program materials carried by every other guest. Inside it, the record waited. Not heavy, not dramatic, simply complete. From the hall, she could hear the swell of applause as the preceding speaker concluded. A stage manager's voice, low and efficient. "Mr. Hale, you're up next." Nia closed her eyes for a moment, not in hesitation, but in acknowledgement. This was the point in every investigation where the subject believed the system still belonged to him, where his valuation was at its peak, where the recalculation would have its full effect. When she opened them again, Her reflection in the mirrored wall showed a woman entirely at rest, composed, luminous, untouched by the tension that would have undone her weeks earlier. The setup was complete. All that remained was the truth, and the moment in which it would be placed, cleanly and without spectacle, into the structure that had been built to receive it. Ethan's voice carried differently from the stage. It always had. It deepened, softened at the edges, shaped itself into something that felt both intimate and authoritative. The voice of a man who understood how to make a room believe not only in his ideas, but in him. Nia stood near the back of the hall, just beyond the main line of cameras, where the light dimmed into a respectful shadow. From there, she watched him become the version of himself the world knew best. On the screen behind him, the word integrity appeared in white against a field of blue. He spoke about transparency, about accountability, about the responsibility that came with managing other people's trust. The audience leaned forward. They always did. There was a cadence to his speech, a rise and fall that suggested sincerity, pauses calibrated for emphasis, the occasional self-effacing smile that made power appear humble. If she had not known the second inbox, the undisclosed address, the courier receipt, she might have applauded with them. Because he was good, that had never been the lie. The lie had been in the alignment between who he was and what he said. As he moved toward his closing, the energy in the room shifted into its familiar arc. The anticipation of the final line. The moment when the audience would stand, the photographers lifting their cameras in unison. Nia felt the exact point at which the valuation reached its peak. It was almost visible, a collective intake of breath. A room ready to seal its belief. He stepped away from the podium, accepting the applause with that practiced humility, one hand briefly pressed to his chest. The moderator moved toward him, smiling, the microphone angled for the transition. This was the moment. Not dramatic, not rushed. Nia stepped forward. She did not move toward the stage. She moved toward the moderator. In Washington, access was not taken. It was granted. The event coordinator recognized her before she spoke, a flicker of professional acknowledgement, the memory of briefings and compliance reviews, the quiet authority of someone who had, more than once, prevented a public misstep. "I need a word with Mr. Caldwell," Nia said softly, using the moderator's name with the familiarity of prior work. Her tone carried no urgency, only necessity. The kind that did not invite refusal. Within seconds, the shift occurred, subtle, invisible to most of the room. The moderator leaned toward her, listening. A stage assistant approached. A brief exchange of glances. This was not interruption as spectacle. This was interruption as procedure. Ethan turned slightly, still smiling, expecting perhaps a final question, an additional donor acknowledgement. Instead, he saw Nia standing just off stage. For the first time that night, the timing of his expression faltered. Not visibly, not to the audience, but she saw it, the microsecond in which calculation replaced performance. The moderator's voice, low, reached him. "A brief compliance clarification," he said, into the microphone, the phrasing careful, neutral. "We'll take a short pause before the closing reception." The room responded with polite patience, the reflex of people accustomed to structured events. No one suspected the recalibration already underway. Nia stepped onto the edge of the stage, not into the light, but just within its perimeter, close enough for him to see her clearly, close enough for those in the front rows to recognize the gravity of her presence. She did not look at the audience. She looked only at him. Up close, he seemed exactly as he always had, composed, controlled, the faint sheen of stage light on his skin, the confidence of a man who had never faced a variable he could not manage. "Nia," he said quietly, the microphone no longer near his mouth, his voice intended for her alone. "What is this?" Her answer was equally quiet. "Governance." One word. The language of his world. She held out the folder, not dramatically, not as an accusation, as a transfer. In any system, the transfer of a record was the moment responsibility changed hands. His fingers did not move immediately. The applause had faded into a low murmur. Conversations began in the back of the hall, the soft rustle of uncertainty. He took the folder. The weight of it was negligible. The impact of it was not. His eyes moved over the first page, the formatting familiar, the structure unmistakable. A risk assessment, not a personal statement, not a claim. A document that asked questions in the only language that mattered here. Exposure, conflict, undisclosed activity. The color left his face not in a sudden drain, but in a gradual withdrawal, like a tide receding. He looked up at her. For a moment, the room, the stage, the audience, all of it ceased to exist. There were only the two of them. "You could have come to me," he said. It was not anger. It was disbelief. And in that disbelief was the final proof that he had never understood who she was. "I did," she replied. "You just didn't know you were being audited." Behind them, the moderator conferred with a man from the board, one of the names she had marked in her plan. The folder in Ethan's hands was no longer the only copy. The structure had already received its data. Lena stood near the side aisle, the silver of her dress catching the light in fractured reflections. Their eyes met. Lena's smile, the one that had survived every room, every crisis, did not appear. Not because she was exposed, because she recognized the form. This was not a lover's confrontation. This was a compliance event, and compliance did not argue. It processed. Nia stepped back, not in retreat, in completion. She did not address the audience. She did not raise her voice. There was no need. The interruption had not been about humiliation. It had been about timing. The precise insertion of truth at the moment belief was at its highest. As she moved off the stage, the room began to reconfigure itself. Conversations shifting in tone, attention redirecting, the subtle but unmistakable movement of influence adjusting to new information. The recalculation had begun. And for the first time since the line on the statement, Nia felt something that was not discipline, not control, not analysis. It was stillness. Not the stillness of waiting, the stillness of a system that had received the record and could no longer return to its previous state. The interruption was complete. The outcome was already in motion. By the time Ethan stepped onto the stage, the room had reached that precise stillness that only power could command. The last round of applause from the previous speaker faded into a hush that felt almost ceremonial. Screens behind him shifted to his name in clean white lettering. The cameras adjusted their angles. A soft wash of light rose from the floor and framed him in the kind of radiance that turned a man into an institution. He began the way he always did, without notes, with that measured confidence that made people lean forward instead of looking down at their phones. Nia did not watch him. She watched the audience, the board chair in the third row, hands folded, posture erect. The institutional partner, 2 seats to the left, expression neutral in the way of men who measured risk as instinct. The legal advisor at the aisle, the same one who had once told her that governance failures never began with numbers. They began with character. They were listening, not as admirers, as evaluators. Ethan spoke about transparency, about the moral responsibility of capital, about the future. Every word landed exactly where it was meant to, and with each sentence, his credibility rose. A valuation curve Nia could almost see, climbing in invisible increments. This was the apex. The moment when trust was at its most expensive, when it would cost the most to lose it. Her folder rested lightly against her palm, not clutched, not hidden, simply held. When the applause began, the long, standing ovation that belonged to men whose narratives had been perfectly delivered, she moved. Not toward the stage, toward the row where the structure of his authority sat in human form. She did not hurry. Power never hurried. The board chair saw her first. Recognition flickered in his eyes, the quiet acknowledgement reserved for professionals who had once shared a closed room in a difficult conversation. "Miss Carter," he said, rising slightly as she approached. "I'm sorry to interrupt your evening," she replied, her voice low, warm, entirely composed. "This will take only a moment." There was no urgency in her tone, no emotion, only the cadence of a briefing. She placed the folder in his hands. not sliding it, not offering it tentatively, delivering it. The legal advisor leaned in almost immediately, a reflex born of decades spent reading what others preferred to remain unseen. The institutional partner shifted closer, his attention drawn not by curiosity, but by the unmistakable language of documentation. The cover page held no accusation, only a title: Risk Exposure Summary, Confidential. Ethan had stepped down from the stage and was moving through the crowd, accepting handshakes, receiving congratulations, his public smile still perfectly calibrated. He saw her then, not where he expected her to be, not near the stage, not waiting for him, but standing beside the people whose signatures determined the architecture of his world. For the first time that night, his stride altered. Just a fraction. The board chair opened the folder. Nia did not speak. She did not need to narrate what they were reading. The structure did that for her. A timeline that aligned declared travel with undisclosed presence. A financial record linked to a third-party residence. A communication channel outside firm governance. No speculation, no interpretation, only correlation. The legal advisor's expression changed first. Not shock, but the narrowing focus of a mind recalculating exposure. The institutional partner's hand stilled on the back of the chair in front of him. Numbers, dates, verifiable records, the language they trusted. Ethan reached them then. "Naya," he said, his voice still carrying the warmth of the stage, though something beneath it had shifted. "What's going on?" She turned to him, not with anger, not with triumph, with the same calm she had once used when handing him a glass of wine across their kitchen counter. "I thought it would be appropriate," she said, her tone professional, almost gentle, "for your governance team to have complete information." The board chair looked up at Ethan, not accusing, assessing. A single page had been turned, the one that summarized the conflict of interest in the language of fiduciary duty. The room around them continued to move, waiters passing with trays, conversations resuming in low tones, the orchestra beginning the next piece. But inside that small circle, the air had altered. Reputation, Nia knew, did not collapse with noise. It recalculated in silence. Lena stood across the room. For a moment, their eyes met. And in that moment, everything that had once been shared between them, the late-night calls, the borrowed dresses, the years of loyalty, reduced itself to a single, unbridgeable distance. Lena understood. Not the details, the outcome. Ethan's gaze moved from Nia to the open folder, to the men holding it, and back again. His public voice, the one that had commanded the stage minutes earlier, did not appear, because there was nothing to perform. This was not an argument, not a private negotiation. This was governance, and governance did not respond to charm. Nia inclined her head slightly to the board chair, the same gesture she used at the end of formal briefings. "That's all," she said. No explanation, no defense, no mention of love, of betrayal, of the architecture of the life that had existed before the line on the statement. She stepped back. The space she left behind did not close. It widened, because now the conversation belonged to the people whose language was not emotion, but risk. As she moved away, the applause from another corner of the room rose again, a delayed echo of the speech that had just elevated Ethan to his highest public valuation. It sounded distant, irrelevant. At the edge of the hall, Nia paused for a moment and looked back, not at him, at the structure. The board chair turning another page, the legal advisor already reaching for his phone, the institutional partner's expression fixed in the stillness of recalculation. Witnesses, not to humiliation, to truth, clean, documented, irrefutable. For weeks she had carried the weight of the knowledge alone, its silence pressing against her ribs, its presence altering every shared room, every familiar gesture. Now it existed where it had always belonged, in the system. And systems, once given complete information, did not require emotion to act. Nia walked toward the exit, the music swelling behind her, the light from the lobby opening like a horizon. She did not hurry, because the outcome was no longer hers to deliver. It was already unfolding, line by careful line, in the hands of those who understood exactly what the record meant. The collapse did not come the way stories usually promised. There was no headline the next morning, no viral clip, no single moment the world could point to and say, "There, that was when he fell." Ethan Hale's career unraveled the way credibility always did in Washington, quietly, formally, in rooms where the doors closed before voices changed. Nia learned about the first shift without anyone telling her. Her phone remained still that morning, no messages, no alerts. But the absence of his name on a scheduled panel notice arrived in her inbox like a line of erased text. The summit's official program had been updated. Closing keynote, speaker TBA. No explanation, just a replacement. In the language of governance, it meant the review had begun. She was at her desk when the second movement occurred. A calendar notification she had not removed yet. A joint charity planning meeting they had once been scheduled to attend together updated itself automatically. Participant removed. Ethan Hale. Not declined, removed. It was a small word, but it carried the full weight of institutional distance. In her years of compliance work, she had watched companies sever ties with executives for less. Not as punishment, as risk management. The third step came later that afternoon, a call she was not meant to receive. A partner at a firm they both knew, a man who had once introduced them at a fundraising dinner, left her a brief voicemail. "Nia, I assume you've seen the internal review. If there's anything you need professionally, we're here." Not sympathy, alignment. The kind offered to someone whose credibility had just been publicly confirmed. Ethan, she realized, had already been categorized, not as a man, as exposure. The free fall continued in increments so precise they felt almost mathematical. An article in a policy newsletter, not about him, but about strengthened governance protocols within several private funds. A postponed announcement regarding a new acquisition his firm had been leading. A photograph from a donor dinner where his usual place at the table was occupied by someone else. No accusations, no scandal, just absence. And in Washington, absence was louder than any headline. She saw him once during those weeks, not by accident, at a cafe they had frequented for years, a place where the staff had known their orders before they spoke. He was sitting alone. No assistant, no second phone on the table, no folder of briefing documents. He looked up when she entered. For a moment, the old reflex appeared. The lift of his shoulders, the beginning of a smile that had once been for her alone. Then it faded. Not because he was angry, because he understood. The distance between them was no longer personal. It was structural. She ordered her coffee the way she always had. The barista's voice was warm, unchanged, but there was a flicker of awareness in her eyes, the kind that came from reading between the lines of professional networks. Nia took her cup and turned. Ethan stood. He did not approach immediately. When he did, he stopped at a distance that was neither intimate nor formal. "You didn't have to do it like that," he said. His voice had lost its public cadence. It was quieter now, the edges stripped of performance. She met his gaze. "I didn't do anything," she replied. "I submitted a record." The distinction mattered. Because it was the truth. He exhaled, the sound almost a laugh, though nothing about it was light. "They've suspended me," he said, "pending review." Not fired, not yet. Another step. In governance, termination was the final act. Suspension was the space where the institution decided how much of you it could afford to lose. "I know," she said. He looked at her then in a way he had not in years. Not as a partner, not as an extension of his own narrative, but as a professional he was finally trying to understand. "They won't let me speak to the donors," he continued. "They've reassigned my accounts. My access to the firm's server is restricted." Each sentence was a dismantling, each word a door closing. Nia felt no triumph, only recognition. This was how systems corrected themselves, not out of morality, out of preservation. "I built that firm," he said. And for the first time there was something in his voice that resembled the man she had once loved. Not powerful, not composed, but human. "I gave them everything." "You gave them a risk they couldn't quantify," she answered gently. It was not cruelty. It was the language he understood. He looked at her as if searching for something. Forgiveness, perhaps, or the possibility of rewriting the ending. But the structure between them had already been finalized. The final step came weeks later, not through him, through a formal notice sent to the board. A resignation, voluntary, effective immediately. The phrasing was careful, dignified, filled with the kind of gratitude that made departure appear strategic rather than inevitable. The press release spoke of new opportunities and time to focus on personal endeavors. The market understood what it meant. Reputation had recalculated. He had not been destroyed. He had been removed. When Nia read the notice, she was in her office with the late afternoon light falling across her desk in long, golden lines. For a moment, she allowed herself to sit without moving, not because she was remembering the man who had once stood in their kitchen and planned a future in 5-year increments, but because she was witnessing the final completion of a process she had set in motion and then released. The freefall had not been dramatic. It had been exact, step by step. Each adjustment made by people who had never known about the bracelet, the second inbox, the undisclosed address. They had not needed to. They had seen the record, and the record had done what truth always did in systems built on trust. It recalculated value. That evening, as the city turned into a lattice of lights beyond her windows, Nia closed the file for the last time. There was no more documentation to review, no more outcomes to model. His career had not ended in flames. It had ended in silence, in the precise, methodical withdrawal of belief. And in that silence, she felt not victory, not relief, but something far more profound. Completion, not of his story, of her participation in it. Lena did not disappear. That would have been too clean. In Washington, women like Lena did not fall in a single motion. They existed in proximity to power, and proximity could linger even after the center collapsed. For the first week, nothing changed on the surface. Her name still appeared on guest lists. Her photographs still lived on event pages. Her social media continued its careful rhythm. A glass of champagne at a rooftop reception, a caption about "grateful for the work we do," a black and white portrait under museum lighting. Access, Nia realized, was not a position. It was an addiction, and Lena had built her entire identity around its supply. The first withdrawal was almost invisible, a gala where her seat moved from the main table to the second. No explanation, just a different place card. The kind of adjustment that, to anyone else, would have meant nothing. But Lena noticed. Nia knew she would, because Access trained you to read rooms the way analysts read markets, scanning for shifts in tone, in proximity, in the angle of someone's body when they greeted you. The second change came in the form of silence, emails that were not answered as quickly, calls that went to assistants instead of principals. A delayed confirmation for a fashion house she had once represented without question. Lena compensated the way she always had. She posted more. She appeared everywhere. At policy dinners, at gallery openings, at charity luncheons where influence was traded in the space between courses. Her smile became brighter, her presence more deliberate. She moved through rooms with a precision that bordered on performance. But the orbit around her had widened. Not dramatically, just enough that when she reached for someone's arm, they were a fraction of a step farther away. It was not rejection. It was recalibration. Nia saw her once across a reception hall, Lena in a dress the color of molten gold, surrounded by people who still laughed at her stories, still leaned in when she spoke. From a distance, nothing had changed. Up close, the difference was unmistakable. She was talking more than she was being listened to. Access, when it began to withdraw, did not leave emptiness. It left noise. The real fracture came through her clients. Not all at once, one at a time. A designer who decided to restructure their PR strategy. A publication that wanted to move in a different direction. An influencer contract that paused indefinitely. Each message was polite, grateful, non-committal. The language of professional disengagement. Lena fought it the only way she knew how. By reaching higher, by attaching herself to names that still carried weight. Her social media began to feature photographs with people whose faces mattered. A senator's wife, a tech founder, a curator whose exhibitions still drew donors. The captions became sharper, more aspirational, less personal, because personal required stability, and stability was what she had lost. Nia understood it with a clarity that had nothing to do with bitterness. Lena had never been in love with Ethan. She had been in love with the access he represented. The private rooms, the donor lists, the proximity to decision-makers. He had been a key, and now the door he opened no longer existed. The night Nia saw her for the last time that season was at a smaller event. Not the grand televised galas Lena preferred, but a policy fundraiser where the guest list mattered more than the decor. Lena arrived late. She always did, fashionably, but when she entered, the room did not shift toward her. It acknowledged her. That was all. She moved through it with the same choreography, air kisses, hands on shoulders, the practiced intimacy of someone who had once belonged everywhere. But Nia watched the details, the way conversations resumed more quickly after Lena stepped away, the way introductions were made without the old enthusiasm, the way the event director greeted her with professional warmth instead of personal delight. Access was not being denied. It was being diluted. Lena saw Nia near the bar. For a moment, their past existed between them. Dorm rooms, shared taxis, whispered confidences, the years when loyalty had been a given. Lena walked toward her. Not with the radiant certainty of before, with calculation. "You look well," she said. It was the same voice, the same cadence, but something beneath it had shifted. A note of effort where once there had been ease. "So do you," Nia replied. They stood there, two women who had once known each other's lives in minute detail, now separated by a truth that had nothing to do with words. "I didn't think you'd still come to these," Lena said lightly, gesturing to the room. "Why wouldn't I?" Nia asked. A small pause. Because Lena understood. This had never been Nia's access. It had always been her own. Lena's smile held for another moment, then softened. Not into apology, not into confession, but into something more honest. Recognition. "I'm rebuilding," she said, not defensively, as a statement. Nia nodded. She believed her, because Lena was a survivor of rooms. She would find new ones, different ones, but the drugs she had once lived on, the effortless entry, the automatic invitations, the certainty of belonging at the center, that was gone. And she knew it. As Lena turned to greet someone else, Nia saw the smallest hesitation before she crossed the room. The fraction of a second where she recalculated her path, choosing the group most likely to receive her. That was the freefall, not the loss of status. The loss of inevitability. Access, once removed, had to be earned again. And earning it was a different life entirely. Nia left the event early. Outside, the night air carried the quiet hum of a city that had already moved on to its next conversation. She did not feel satisfaction, only a distant, almost tender understanding. They had all been altered by the same truth. Ethan had lost the system that validated him. Lena had lost the orbit that defined her. And Nia had lost the illusion that proximity to power was the same as power itself. As she walked toward her car, the lights of Washington reflected in the glass buildings like 1,000 small stages. Inside them, people were still speaking, still negotiating, still trading in credibility. Access was still the most valuable currency in the city. But for the first time in her life, she felt no desire to stand at its center because she had discovered something far rarer. She could leave the room and still belong to herself. The first morning she woke without checking her phone for his name, Nia understood the difference between silence and peace. Silence had weight. It pressed against your ribs, waited in the pauses between breaths, filled the room with everything that had once been said and could never be unsaid. Peace did not wait. It moved. It existed in the way sunlight crossed the floor of her apartment without needing to be witnessed, in the sound of the coffee machine at 6:30, in the quiet order of a life that no longer required verification. Washington continued as it always did, motorcades cutting through intersections, policy briefings beginning before dawn, invitations circulating through encrypted calendars. Her name still appeared, not as an attachment, not as an extension of someone else's narrative. On its own, Director Carter will be leading the review. Ms. Carter's assessment has been requested. We defer to Nia's recommendation. For years, she had moved through these rooms as a stabilizing force behind someone else's rise. Now she entered them alone. And something subtle but undeniable shifted when she did. Conversations paused, not in curiosity, but in recognition. Not of scandal, of authority. Untouchable did not mean unreachable. It meant ungoverned by anyone else's perception. She did not need to scan a room for Lena's silver dress or Ethan's familiar posture near the donor tables. Their names had receded into the background noise of a city that was always replacing one story with another. What remained was structure. Her structure. Her work expanded in ways she had not planned but somehow always anticipated. Institutions requested her presence not because she was careful. There were many careful people, but because she was incorruptible in a way that felt almost unsettling. She could not be leveraged. She could not be manipulated by proximity. She had already walked through the loss of both. The night she returned to the Kennedy Center, months later, for a different summit, a different cause, the air felt the same. Marble, light, the low orchestral hum of influence gathering. She stood at the top of the steps for a moment, before entering, not remembering, not comparing, simply acknowledging the architecture of a place where she had once delivered the most precise act of her life. Inside, her reflection in the glass doors showed a woman no longer carrying evidence, no longer holding a plan, only herself. Someone called her name. A young analyst she had mentored, eyes bright with the kind of admiration that had nothing to do with headlines. "You changed how they do governance here," the woman said softly. "They use your case as the model." Nia smiled, not because she needed the validation, because she recognized the truth of it. What she had built out of betrayal had become a framework for other women to walk into rooms without needing protection. That was the real recalculation. Later that evening, standing near the stage as another speaker finished to applause, she felt the familiar energy of a room aligning around a narrative. Once, she had been part of that alignment. Then she had dismantled it. Now she stood outside it entirely, untouched. Not because she was untouchable to pain. She had known pain intimately, had watched it rewrite her from the inside out. But because nothing in this city, no invitation, no name, no proximity, could determine her value again. Her phone vibrated once in her clutch. A message from an unknown number. "I see you. You're extraordinary." She did not open it. She did not need to know who had sent it. Because for the first time in her life, recognition was not something she consumed. It was something she generated. As she walked toward the exit, the doors opening to the night air, the city stretched before her, not as a battlefield, not as a marketplace of access, but as a landscape she could enter or leave without losing herself. Freedom, she had learned, was not the absence of memory. It was the absence of ownership. No one held her story anymore. Not Ethan, not Lena, not the rooms that once measured her worth by the company she kept. Only her. And that was what made her untouchable. If her journey felt like a mirror to your own, if you've ever chosen yourself in a world that told you to stay small, let this story keep moving. Leave a like so more women can find it when they need it most. Write in the comments the moment you realize your power no longer depended on someone else. And follow the channel for the next story, because reinvention is not an ending. It's a language. And you're already learning how to speak it.